China is responding strongly to the wave of tariffs imposed by the United States, with actions that could reshape the global trade landscape. How long will this confrontation last? And how will the everyday lives of citizens in both countries be affected? In 2025, the administration of President Trump imposed tariffs of up to 145% on Chinese goods, comprising a 125% retaliatory duty in response to subsidies and an additional 20% related to fentanyl, a substance linked to over 80,000 deaths annually in the United States, according to Reuters. The steep tariffs have significantly raised the prices of Chinese goods in the U.S. A laptop that once cost $600 may now exceed $1,000. Consumers are having to spend more, particularly on electronics, kitchenware, and clothing. Small businesses are also facing challenges due to higher input costs. At the same time, the U.S. is negotiating with more than 70 countries to prevent China from using transshipment routes to circumvent the tariffs. This effort has led to a drop in orders for many Chinese export factories. In Guangdong, certain areas have reduced working hours, affecting the incomes of millions of workers. Nevertheless, President Trump remains optimistic that an agreement can be reached within weeks. In the meantime, people in both countries are feeling the impact, reflected in everything from shopping bills to monthly wages. China remains firmly unyielding in trade negotiations with the United States, primarily due to its Made in China 2025 strategy, an industrial upgrade initiative aimed at establishing leadership in critical sectors such as artificial intelligence, robotics, semiconductors, electric vehicles, and healthcare. This program is supported by substantial state subsidies and preferential policies, raising concerns among the United States and other Western nations regarding potential unfair competition and the risk of losing technological preeminence. To pursue this objective, China has invested heavily in research and development, R&D. In 2024, the country's R&D spending reached 3.61 trillion yuan, approximately USD 497 billion, accounting for 2.68% of its GDP, an increase of 8.3% compared to the previous year. This level of investment has enhanced China's innovation capabilities and brought it closer to the status of more advanced economies. Additionally, China plays a pivotal role in the global supply chain. The nation supplies over 80% of the world's electronic components, 70% of medical devices, and 60% of pharmaceutical ingredients. This level of dependency makes it significantly challenging and costly for businesses and consumers worldwide to replace Chinese sources. Given such technological positioning and supply chain influence, China has strong motivation to maintain a firm stance in trade negotiations, aiming to safeguard its strategic interests and avoid being subjected to potentially unfavorable terms. China has imposed retaliatory tariffs of up to 125% in response, restricted rare earth exports, and launched anti-monopoly investigations targeting U.S. companies. However, these actions are unlikely to offset the losses stemming from reduced access to the U.S. market, a major destination for Chinese exports. In the first quarter of 2025, China's GDP grew by 5.4%, bolstered by a surge in exports ahead of the implementation of new U.S. tariffs. Yet, projections suggest that full-year growth may only reach 4.5%, or even decline to 3.4% should tensions persist, UBS. This situation is increasing pressure on employment and income, particularly in the export sector. The real estate sector continues to weaken. Forecasts indicate home prices could drop by an additional 20 to 25% in 2025, as many households consider real estate a primary form of accumulated wealth. This trend could significantly erode personal asset values. Economic-related protests are on the rise. In the fourth quarter of 2024, the number of such incidents increased by 41% compared to the same period the previous year. largely driven by workers and home buyers protesting delayed wages and postponed project deliveries. In the United States, tariffs have pushed up the prices of Chinese imports. For example, a toaster that once cost $30 now sells for $75. Consumers are feeling the strain on their budgets, and small businesses are grappling with rising input costs. Meanwhile, total bilateral direct investment reached approximately $240 billion by the end of 2023, underscoring deep economic interdependence despite escalating tensions. Are more Americans ready to leave the U.S.? More Americans are choosing to leave their homeland in search of a better life abroad. Is the U.S. entering a period of decline, not just economically, but also in terms of trust and national confidence? In February 2025, the Americans Expat Survey found that 68% of respondents believe owning a home in the U.S. is out of reach for the average person. Many say they feel like they're just surviving, not progressing. Disillusioned with political promises, particularly from Trump, and worn down by daily financial pressure, more Americans are considering a life overseas. Rent prices in U.S. cities have surged to an average of $250 per month, a 23% increase since 2020. Home ownership is increasingly unattainable, especially for younger generations. Only 38% of Americans under 35 own a home, down from 45% a decade ago. Political dissatisfaction is also rising. According to Gallup, just 17% of Americans say they trust Congress. The mix of economic strain and political frustration is pushing more people to explore expatriation and offshore planning. Geopolitical expert Andrew Henderson emphasized, traditional U.S. influence is eroding in a multipolar world where bully tactics no longer work. Countries like China, Russia, and Gulf states are now favoring mutual cooperation and creating independent structures outside U.S. control. For example, BRICS nations now account for 36% of global GDP, surpassing the G7's 29% for the first time in 2024. The China-led cross-border interbank payment system, CEPS, is expanding, offering an alternative to the U.S.-dominated SWIFT network. Gulf states, including Saudi Arabia and the UAE, are increasingly conducting oil trade in yuan rather than dollars. These changes signal a structural shift in power that could reduce U.S. bargaining leverage. For ordinary Americans, this means less global reach, higher international costs, and potential limits on overseas business or relocation options. The U.S. no longer sets the rules, it's now competing to stay in the game. Since 2000, the U.S. dollar's share of global central bank reserves has dropped from 71% to just under 59%, marking a 20% decline in its dominant role. This shift is accelerating as countries diversify into Chinese yuan, euro, and gold, reducing reliance on the dollar for international trade. The trend is particularly stark in Asia and Latin America, where more than 30 bilateral trade agreements now bypass the USD entirely. For American citizens, this global shift has tangible consequences. A weaker dollar means higher import prices, especially for fuel, electronics, and food. As the dollar's credibility erodes, borrowing costs could rise, pushing up interest rates on credit cards, mortgages, and car loans. Inflation risks would deepen, hitting lower and middle-income households the hardest. Geopolitical consultant Andrew Henderson warns, the U.S. passport is becoming a liability rather than a privilege in the eyes of many nations. In 2024, the U.S. passport dropped to 8th place on the Henley Passport Index, offering visa-free access to 184 countries, down from 187 in 2018. At the same time, the number of foreigners applying for U.S. green cards fell by 23%, citing concerns over political division, mass shootings, and economic volatility. Meanwhile, countries like the UAE now grant investor residence permits in under 2 hours, while Singapore and Portugal offer tax-friendly paths to residency. This shift affects not only global mobility for Americans, but also business competitiveness. International firms increasingly avoid partnerships with U.S. citizens due to complex tax reporting rules, FATCA, and rising geopolitical tensions. For U.S. citizens abroad, travel, investment, and banking are becoming more restricted, signaling a decline in global trust and openness toward the American identity. Signaling a decline in global trust and openness toward the American identity. The United States and China have entered a new phase of confrontation, marked by retaliatory tariffs and clearly defined strategies to shift market focus. The key question now is whether this latest escalation is merely temporary, or if it signals a turning point in the global economic order. In its latest statement, Beijing has urged Washington to remove all current tariffs and correct the mistakes in its bilateral trade policy, expressing hopes for a more comprehensive and stable approach to U.S.-China trade relations. The statement came shortly after the United States announced temporary tariff exemptions on certain electronic goods imported from China. China's Ministry of Commerce emphasized that the U.S. exemptions represent only a small step and are not sufficient to improve the overall trade environment between the world's two largest economies. According to data from DW News and Reuters, current U.S. tariffs on Chinese goods range from 7.5% to 25%, depending on the product category, with a total annual tariff value of approximately $370 billion since 2018-2019. Recently, China officially imposed a 125% import tariff on a range of goods from the United States, sending a clear signal that Beijing is prepared to retaliate in defense of its economic interests. According to analysis from DW News and updates from CNBC, the U.S. has expanded tariffs on multiple categories of Chinese goods, including agricultural products, processed foods, medical equipment, and various industrial items, particularly those in high-tech sectors, electronic components, and smart devices, which represent key pillars of China's exports to the U.S. Experts note that the significant tariff increases from both sides reflect the current level of strain in bilateral trade policy and are expected to place pressure on both economies. According to Ms. Veena Najibullah, Vice President of Research and Strategy at the Asia-Pacific Foundation of Canada, the United States' decision to grant temporary tariff exemptions on certain electronic goods stems from pressure by major technology firms such as Apple, NVIDIA, and Dell. Approximately 24% of total U.S. imports from China fall under the electronics category, making this move economically significant. While seen as a concession, the measure provides only temporary relief. Southeast Asian economies such as Vietnam, Malaysia, and Cambodia have also indirectly benefited due to their closely integrated supply chains with China. On the other side, China's response goes beyond tariffs. Beijing has also imposed controls on the export of strategic raw materials, initiated investigations into U.S. companies, and limited the distribution of cultural products. Although more assertive than in 2018, China still leaves room for dialogue, as it remains dependent on the U.S. market, with export volume reaching approximately $500 billion in 2024. The current response strategy reflects Beijing's increasing flexibility in trade coordination and its growing use of non-tariff instruments to expand influence. According to DW News, President Xi Jinping conducted an official visit to Southeast Asia this week, aiming to strengthen cooperation in trade, investment, and supply chains. In parallel, China has intensified its diplomatic engagement with Europe, hosting a Spanish delegation, and holding deeper dialogues with the European Union on energy, technology, and environmental issues. China's active efforts to solidify ties with Southeast Asia and Europe reflect a broader, long-term strategic direction, diversifying export markets and reducing reliance on the U.S. market. Meanwhile, the ongoing restructuring of global supply chains, including the trend of relocating manufacturing away from China, is creating a new competitive landscape. In this environment, Southeast Asia and parts of Europe are emerging both as partners and as competitors in the race to attract investment. Rising living costs and small businesses struggling to stay afloat. What is happening with the U.S. economy? New policies that were intended to be solutions are instead leaving millions of people facing difficulties. According to a report from the Budget Lab at Yale University, the new tariffs imposed by the Trump administration could cost American households an additional $4,700 by 2025. This increase is primarily driven by the rising prices of the imported goods, particularly those from China, due to tariffs as high as 145%. Many American businesses have started applying surcharges directly to customer invoices in order to offset the increased costs. These surcharges could be either fixed amounts, e.g., $5, or calculated as a percentage, up to 40% of the total order value. Industries most affected include electronics. The price of devices like laptops and smartphones could rise by 30% to 50% due to the increased costs of importing components from China and other Asian countries. Fashion and footwear. With about 97% of clothing and 99% of footwear in the U.S. being imported, retail prices for these goods are expected to increase significantly. For example, a pair of children's shoes from China could increase in price from $26 to $41. Other consumer goods, products like toys, cleaning supplies, and furniture, are also subject to high tariffs, leading to higher retail prices and directly affecting consumers' wallets. According to the latest data from the University of Michigan, the U.S. Consumer Confidence Index dropped by 11% in April 2025 compared to the previous month, falling to 50.8 points. This marks the second lowest level in history since 1952, just above the lowest recorded level in June 2022. One key factor contributing to this decline is the rise in inflation expectations for the next 12 months, which has reached 6.7%, the highest level since 1981. This indicates growing concerns among consumers about the potential for continued price increases. Additionally, the percentage of consumers predicting higher unemployment rates over the next year has reached its highest point since 2009, signaling a rise in worries about the labor market. The new tariff policies have created numerous challenges for small businesses, particularly in terms of planning and maintaining operations. For example, Beth Pratt, the owner of a small cookie business in Denver, has faced rising costs for ingredients, particularly eggs and chocolate, as well as higher packaging costs due to tariffs on imports from China. Pratt noted that sourcing domestic supplies is not viable due to high prices and minimum order requirements. In Idaho, Casey Ames, the owner of Harkla, a company importing sensory toys for children, saw his tariffs increase from $26,000 to $346,000 overnight. He explained that these rising costs could force him to close down his company's product line. Additionally, Ramon Gonzalez, an Amazon seller, faced a sharp tariff increase from 54% to 145% within just a week, jeopardizing his ability to keep his business running. The U.S. Congress is currently reviewing a new budget plan, proposing to cut approximately $880 billion from Medicaid and nutrition assistance programs, like SNAP, over the next decade. The goal of this plan is to create room for extending tax cuts from 2017, benefiting higher-income households. Meanwhile, low- and middle-income households may face reductions or the loss of access to essential health and food assistance services. A study from the Economic Policy Institute revealed that the lowest 20% of households would only receive a 0.6% increase in income from tax cuts, but could lose up to 7.4% of their income due to Medicaid cuts, resulting in a net loss of approximately 6.8%. Additionally, new tariffs are impacting consumer spending. According to a report from Yale's Budget Lab, households earning between $30,000 and $60,000 annually could lose about 4% of their disposable income due to rising prices on imported goods, while households earning $175,000 or more would only lose about 1.6%. Tensions between the United States and Germany are rising over tariffs and U.S. bonds, adding uncertainty to global financial markets. Europe's move toward greater strategic autonomy and the potential repatriation of gold reserves may reshape the global economic landscape. German Economy Minister Robert Habeck expressed concern about how the U.S. calculates tariffs, especially in the pharmaceutical sector. He emphasized the need for both countries to consider mutual impacts when applying trade measures. Germany is one of the world's top pharmaceutical exporters, accounting for about 14 to 15% of global pharmaceutical exports in 2024, according to Eurostat. U.S. demand for European pharmaceuticals continues to grow, with average annual imports increasing around 6% from 2020 to 2024, according to Bloomberg. Recent U.S. bond auctions have seen lower participation, raising concerns that foreign investors, including those in Europe and Asia, may slow down purchases or reduce their holdings. Reports suggest Germany is considering moving 1,200 tons of gold, valued at approximately $124 billion, from the Federal Reserve in New York back to Germany. If carried out, the move would aim to strengthen national control over reserves amid global instability. Under President Biden, the U.S. economy and stock markets have shown stable growth, with some indexes reaching strong annual gains, Bloomberg Financial Times. In contrast, during Trump's term, U.S. market performance often lagged behind economies like Japan, Canada, the UK, Germany, and China. Biden has focused on rebuilding multilateral alliances, particularly NATO and ties with Europe, to support global stability. In contrast, the Trump administration took a different foreign policy approach, shifting traditional partnerships and cooperation strategies. Minister Habeck and other EU leaders stressed the importance of unity in external trade talks, urging member states to avoid individual country negotiations in order to protect the EU's long-term interests. The EU is expanding trade relations with major partners such as South Korea, Japan, India, and Indonesia, aiming to diversify markets and reduce dependence on any single economy. It is also considering joining the CPTPP Trade Pact as part of its broader global strategy. European leaders are prioritizing reduced reliance on external partners in key areas like defense and economic security. CDU leader Friedrich Merz highlighted the need for greater autonomy and the ability to respond to challenges independently and proactively.